Across the Delaware River from Philadelphia's gleaming skyline, empty factories stand like tombstones. Their windows are shattered, their walls covered in graffiti, their floors littered with debris from decades of abandonment. This is Camden, a city that once hummed with the sound of production, where millions of soup cans rolled off assembly lines, where ships were built for 2 world wars, where American innovation took physical form in factories that employed tens of thousands. The streets are quiet now, lined with vacant lots where homes once stood, where children once played, where families once believed in the promise of steady work and a secure future. Camden's tragedy is not that it failed. It is that it succeeded too well at something that was never meant to last. The corporations that built this city, Campbell Soup, RCA Victor, New York Shipbuilding, created an economy so dependent on their presence that when they left, everything collapsed. Jobs vanished faster than the population could adapt. The middle class fled to suburbs that promised safety and better schools. Tax revenue disappeared, making it impossible to maintain even basic services. Within a generation, one of America's hardest working industrial cities became one of its poorest, most dangerous places to live. The proximity makes the fall even more cruel. Minutes across the river sits wealth and opportunity. Here sits abandonment and decay. This is how a city dies when corporations decide it is no longer profitable. This is the story of Camden. If you enjoy uncovering the history of these American cities and their secrets, you're welcome to subscribe and explore more with me. Chapter 1. Before the factories. Before Camden became a factory town, it was a crossing. The Delaware River separated 2 shores, and for travelers heading south from Philadelphia, Camden was where the ferry landed. This was not destiny, but geography. The river was wide here, but manageable. The banks offered solid ground for docking. By the early 1800s, a small settlement had formed around the ferry landing, consisting of taverns, stables, and the modest homes of people who made their living from the constant flow of travelers. The settlement grew slowly at first. Philadelphia across the water was already a major city, a center of commerce and culture. Camden existed in its shadow, defined by its relationship to the larger city rather than any identity of its own. Farmers from the surrounding countryside brought produce to sell to Philadelphia merchants. Travelers stopped for the night before continuing their journeys. The ferry operators became wealthy enough to build proper houses. But Camden remained small, a footnote to Philadelphia's story. The transformation began with the railroads. In the 1830s, the Camden and Amboy Railroad established its terminus at the ferry landing. Suddenly, Camden was not just a crossing point, but a connection between 2 major transportation networks. Trains from the south and west terminated here, and passengers transferred to ferries bound for Philadelphia. Freight followed the same route. Goods that once moved slowly by wagon now arrived by rail, crossed the river, and reached one of America's most important markets. This convergence of rail and water created opportunity. Manufacturers recognized what the location offered: cheap land compared to Philadelphia, access to the same markets through the ferry connection, and rail lines that could bring raw materials and ship finished products. The first factories appeared in the 1840s and 1850s, small operations making textiles, leather goods, and metal products. They employed dozens rather than thousands, but they established a pattern that would define Camden's future. In 1873, an aging poet arrived in Camden seeking a quieter life after a stroke had left him partially paralyzed. Walt Whitman was already famous, his Leaves of Grass having scandalized and inspired readers for nearly 2 decades. He purchased a modest house on Mickle Street and settled into what he assumed would be his final years. Whitman found Camden unremarkable, calling it a place of dullness, darkness, and despair in some moods, yet he stayed until his death in 1892. Edda's presence gave the growing industrial town an unexpected cultural significance. Visitors came to meet the poet, and his writing about American life and labor would later seem prophetic given what Camden would become. By the 1880s, Camden had developed beyond a ferry town into something more substantial. The population climbed past 20,000. Streets were laid out in a grid extending back from the waterfront. Neighborhoods formed around ethnic churches. Small businesses lined Broadway, the main commercial street. the city incorporated officially, establishing its own government separate from the rural township that surrounded it. The stage was set for transformation. Camden had the infrastructure, rail connections, river access, proximity to major markets, and available land. It had the workforce, immigrants arriving from Europe, workers from rural areas seeking opportunity, and easy access to Philadelphia's larger labor pool. What it needed was the arrival of major industry, the kind of factories that would employ thousands and make Camden essential to American commerce. That arrival was coming, and it would change everything. The ferry town was about to become a factory town, and for several decades, that transformation would seem like the greatest thing that had ever happened to the city. Chapter 2: The Industrial Awakening. In 1869, a fruit merchant named Joseph Campbell partnered with an icebox manufacturer named Abraham Anderson to start a canning business in Camden. The location made practical sense. Produce from New Jersey farms could arrive by wagon, tin for cans came by rail. The finished products could be shipped across the river to Philadelphia or loaded onto trains heading in every direction. The business started small, operating from a modest building near the waterfront, employing a handful of workers who processed tomatoes, vegetables, and jellies. The partnership dissolved within a few years, but Campbell continued alone, focusing on a product that seemed to have unusual potential: condensed soup. By removing water before canning, the soup took up less space, weighed less, and cost less to ship. Customers could add water at home. The idea was simple but transformative. In 1897, a chemist named John Dorrance joined the company and perfected the condensation process, creating soups that tasted better and lasted longer than anything competitors offered. The business exploded. Condensed soup became an American staple, affordable and convenient at a time when many families still cooked everything from scratch. Campbell's distinctive red and white can design appeared in 1898, inspired by the Cornell University football team uniforms. The design became one of the most recognizable images in American commerce, reproduced millions of times, eventually celebrated by Andy Warhol decades later as an icon of American culture. But in the early 1900s, it was simply the can that everyone recognized, the product that every grocery store carried. The company expanded rapidly, constructing new buildings that sprawled across Camden's waterfront. By 1910, Campbell Soup employed thousands of workers. The production lines operated constantly during harvest season, processing tomatoes and vegetables as fast as they arrived. The smell of cooking soup filled entire neighborhoods. The sight of workers streaming in and out of the factory gates at shift changes became part of Camden's daily rhythm. Campbell's had transformed from a small canning operation into a major corporation, and Camden was its home. In 1899, another industry arrived that would reshape the city even more dramatically. Henry Morse and a group of investors established the New York Shipbuilding Corporation on Camden's waterfront. The name was misleading. The company had no connection to New York except for some of its financial backers. The location was chosen for practical reasons: deep water access on the Delaware River, rail connections for bringing in steel and equipment, and proximity to Philadelphia's skilled workforce. The shipyard started with modest contracts, building merchant vessels and small naval ships. The work required enormous amounts of space. The company acquired waterfront land stretching for nearly a mile, constructing massive building ways where ships could be assembled, cranes to lift heavy components, and shops for manufacturing the thousands of parts each vessel required. By the early 1900s, the shipyard employed several thousand workers engaged in some of the most skilled industrial labor in America. Building a ship required metal workers, welders, electricians, carpenters, painters, and dozens of other specialized trades. The third giant arrived in 1901 when the Victor Talking Machine Company established operations in Camden. The company manufactured phonographs and recordings, riding the wave of a technology that was transforming American entertainment. In 1929, RCA purchased Victor and created RCA Victor, establishing Camden as a center of innovation in radio, recording, and later television technology. The company's trademark became even more famous than its products. A painting of a dog named Nipper, listening to a phonograph titled His Master's Voice, was purchased by the company and became one of the most recognizable corporate symbols in the world. the image appeared on millions of products, in advertisements, and eventually in a massive stained glass window at the Camden factory. Nipper the dog became synonymous with RCA Victor, and RCA Victor was synonymous with Camden. These three corporations, Campbell's Soup, New York Shipbuilding, and RCA Victor, did not arrive in isolation. Dozens of smaller manufacturers established operations in Camden during the same period, attracted by the same advantages the giants had recognized. Machine shops, metal fabricators, chemical plants, and textile mills sprouted across the city. By 1920, Camden had become one of the most industrialized cities in America relative to its size, with manufacturing employment density that rivaled anywhere in the country. The jobs drew people from around the world. Irish immigrants who had arrived in earlier decades were joined by waves of Italians, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, and immigrants from a dozen other countries. They came for work that paid wages unimaginable in the villages they had left behind. A factory job in Camden might pay $2 or $3 a day, enough to rent a room, buy food, and send money back to family members still in Europe. The work was hard, the hours long, but the opportunity was real. Neighborhoods organized along ethnic lines, each group clustering together for mutual support and cultural continuity. The Irish settled in the northern sections, building Catholic churches that became community centers. Italians concentrated in South Camden, establishing groceries and social clubs where their language was spoken and their traditions maintained. Poles and Eastern Europeans formed their own enclaves, marked by Orthodox churches and meeting halls. Each neighborhood developed its own character, yet all were united by the factory whistles that regulated daily life across the entire city. The physical landscape transformed at astonishing speed. In 1880, Camden was still a small city of about 40,000 people, with empty lots scattered throughout and farms visible at the edges. By 1920, the population had nearly tripled to over 116,000, and the city had filled in completely. Factories lined the waterfront and spread inland. Row houses appeared block after block, built quickly to house the arriving workforce. Streets that had been dirt lanes were paved. Trolley lines were installed to move workers from neighborhoods to factories. Schools were constructed to educate the children of immigrants. Broadway became the commercial heart, lined with shops, theaters, and businesses serving the growing population. Department stores opened, recognizing Camden as a market worth serving. Banks established branches to handle the deposits of factory workers. Restaurants, saloons, and social clubs multiplied. The city developed infrastructure at a pace designed to keep up with industrial growth rather than plan for it. Water systems, sewers, electrical lines, all were installed to serve the factories first, and the neighborhoods second. The growth seemed unstoppable and permanent. Every year brought more factories, more jobs, more people. Camden's assessed property value climbed steadily as new construction appeared everywhere. The tax base expanded, allowing the city government to provide services and infrastructure. This was progress as Americans understood it in the early 20th century. Growth, industry, employment, prosperity. The city had transformed from a ferry landing into an industrial powerhouse in just a few decades, and everyone involved assumed this was the beginning of something that would last generations. The factories were built from brick and steel, solid and permanent. The corporations proclaimed Camden as their home. The workers believed their children would follow them into the same factories, earning the same steady wages, building the same kind of lives. Nothing suggested that the foundation was less stable than it appeared, or that the corporations that had built Camden would one day decide they no longer needed it. Chapter 3. The Golden Age. Between the 1920s and 1950s, Camden reached its peak. The population climbed past 125,000, making it one of the larger cities in the region. Every neighborhood was full, every factory was hiring, and the future seemed secure. This was Camden's golden age, when the industrial model appeared to work exactly as promised. Corporations provided jobs, workers earned steady wages, families built lives, and the city thrived on the arrangement. The neighborhoods each had their own identity, shaped by the immigrants who had settled there and built communities that felt like transplanted villages. In the northern sections, Irish families dominated, their Catholic churches anchoring blocks of row houses where Gaelic could still be heard on front stoops. The churches were more than places of worship. They were community centers where marriages were celebrated, children were educated in parish schools, and social networks were maintained. Holy Name, St. Joseph's, and Sacred Heart became landmarks that defined neighborhoods as clearly as street names. South Camden belonged to the Italians, where groceries sold imported olive oil and fresh pasta, where social clubs displayed Italian flags alongside American ones, and where festivals celebrating patron saints drew entire neighborhoods into the streets. The smell of cooking filled the air on Sunday afternoons. Families maintained traditions from provinces they had left behind, yet their children were becoming American, attending public schools and working in the same factories as every other ethnic group. Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian immigrants established their own enclaves in East Camden, building Orthodox churches with distinctive onion domes that stood out against the industrial skyline. These communities maintained old world customs while embracing the economic opportunities that America offered. The men worked in the factories and shipyards. The women raised children and took in boarders to supplement family income. Everyone saved for the day when they could buy rather than rent, achieving a version of the American dream that was modest but real. The shipyards became Camden's economic heartbeat, especially during wartime. When America entered World War I in 1917, New York shipbuilding received massive government contracts for destroyers, cargo ships, and support vessels. Employment exploded. The shipyard operated around the clock, with multiple shifts keeping the building ways constantly active. At peak production, over 35,000 people worked in the yards, making it one of the largest employers in the region. The wages were good, often better than other factory work, because the skills required were considerable and the work was dangerous. World War II brought an even larger surge. The shipyard built battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and dozens of other vessels for the Navy. The USS New Jersey, one of the most famous battleships in American history, was built and launched in Camden in 1942. The work was patriotic and profitable, binding the city's fate to national priorities. Rosie the Riveter was not just propaganda in Camden. Women worked in the shipyards alongside men, welding, riveting, and assembling the vessels that would carry the war to the Pacific and Atlantic. Campbell's Soup had become more than a local employer. It was an American institution. The red and white cans appeared in grocery stores from coast to coast. The company's advertising campaigns became part of popular culture, featuring healthy children and happy families enjoying soup at dinner. Radio jingles spread the brand into American homes. Campbell's sponsored programs and events, making its name synonymous with wholesome American values. The company's headquarters remained in Camden, a point of civic pride. The executives lived in the city or nearby suburbs. The corporation seemed rooted in the place where it had started. R.C.A. Victor led the world in entertainment technology. The engineers and technicians working in Camden's facilities helped develop innovations that changed American life. The company pioneered commercial radio broadcasting, created some of the first televisions, and advanced recording technology that captured the biggest stars of the era: Enrico Caruso, Arturo Toscanini, and countless other musical legends were recorded on RCA Victor equipment, much of it manufactured in Camden. The Nipper Dog logo became so iconic that generations of Americans could recognize it instantly, and the stained glass Nipper window at the Camden factory became a beloved local landmark. In 1933, Camden added another first to American history. Richard Hollingshead Jr. opened the world's first drive-in movie theater on Admiral Wilson Boulevard. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Families could watch movies from their cars, creating a new form of entertainment perfectly suited to America's automobile culture. The idea spread across the country, and drive-ins became a defining feature of mid-century American life. That the first one opened in Camden seemed fitting for a city that was constantly innovating and contributing to American culture. Broadway thrived as Camden's commercial center, lined with department stores, restaurants, movie palaces, and shops of every kind. Lit Theater and the Stanley Theater hosted vaudeville acts, films, and stage performances. On Saturday nights, the streets filled with people shopping, eating, and socializing. The stores stayed open late. The restaurants served customers until midnight. This was urban life at its best, dense and walkable, with everything accessible without a car. Families could walk from their row houses to buy groceries, see a movie, eat dinner, and return home, all within a few blocks. Home ownership became achievable for factory workers in ways it had never been before. Banks offered mortgages to people with steady employment. The row houses were affordable on a factory wage. A machinist at the shipyard or a line worker at Campbell's could save enough for a down payment and buy a house where his family would live for generations. These were not grand homes, but they were solid, with small front yards, porches where neighbors gathered, and enough room to raise children. Ownership meant stability, a stake in the community, and something to pass down. The city invested in institutions that served the population. Libraries opened in multiple neighborhoods, funded by Andrew Carnegie's philanthropy and local tax revenue. Public schools were built to handle the growing population of children. Parks provided green space in a dense urban environment. The waterfront, despite being dominated by industry, still had areas where people could access the river. Everything suggested a city that was functioning, growing, and confident in its future. Walt Whitman had died in 1892, but his legacy grew more significant as the decades passed. His tomb in Harley Cemetery became a destination for literary pilgrims. The house where he had lived on Mickle Street was preserved, turning into a museum that welcomed visitors who wanted to see where the great poet had spent his final years. For a gritty industrial city, having a connection to one of America's most celebrated writers provided cultural legitimacy. Whitman had captured the dignity of labor and the democratic spirit in his poetry, themes that resonated in a city built by working people. Civic organizations flourished. Fraternal lodges, union halls, ethnic societies, and church groups created dense networks of social connection. These were not luxuries, but necessities in a world without government safety nets. If a worker was injured or killed, his lodge brothers would contribute to support the widow. If a family faced hardship, the church would organize assistance. The unions fought for better wages and safer conditions, but they also provided community and solidarity. Membership in these organizations was nearly universal among working men, creating bonds that crossed ethnic lines even as neighborhoods remained segregated. The illusion was nearly perfect. Camden seemed to have found a sustainable model where private industry and working-class prosperity coexisted. The corporations were profitable, the workers were employed, the city was growing, and the future looked bright. Everyone assumed the factories would always need workers, that their children would follow them onto the production lines and into the shipyards, that Camden would continue to thrive as it had for decades. The buildings were permanent, constructed from brick and steel. The corporations had invested millions. The population was stable and growing. Every indicator suggested strength and continuity. No one imagined that within a generation, most of it would be gone, that the corporations would leave, that the neighborhoods would empty, and that the golden age would be remembered as a brief moment before catastrophic decline. Chapter 4. The Working Life. The factory whistles controlled time in Camden. At 6 a.m, the first shift whistle blew, a sound that carried across the entire city and woke those who had somehow slept through their alarm clocks. Workers poured from row houses, walking toward the factories in streams that converged at the gates. By 7, the production lines were running. At 3 p.m, the day shift ended and the evening shift began. Another wave of workers passing the first as they headed in opposite directions. The pattern repeated at 11 at night when the graveyard shift took over. The city never fully slept because the factories never stopped. Inside Campbell's Soup, the work followed the rhythm of the harvest. During tomato season, the processing lines operated at maximum capacity. Trucks arrived from New Jersey farms loaded with produce that had been picked that morning. Workers unloaded the tomatoes, feeding them into machines that washed, sorted, and chopped them. The smell of cooking tomatoes filled the factory and spilled out into the surrounding streets, a scent that everyone in Camden recognized immediately. The production line was relentless. Women worked the assembly sections, filling cans, checking seals, and packing finished products into cases. Men handled the heavier work, operating machinery, moving pallets, loading trucks. The noise was constant. Machines clanged, conveyor belts rattled, supervisors shouted instructions over the din. Workers learned to communicate through hand signals and by reading lips. By the end of a shift, your ears rang and your feet ached from standing on concrete floors for 8 hours. But the work was steady, and steady work meant everything. A job at Campbell's could support a family. The pay was modest, but reliable. Women earned less than men for the same hours, a discrimination accepted as natural at the time, but even their wages contributed meaningfully to household income. Many families counted on both parents working to afford homeownership and save for their children's futures. The shipyard demanded a different kind of labor entirely. Building a ship required skilled trades, welders who could create seams strong enough to withstand ocean pressure, electricians who wired complex systems, pipe fitters who installed miles of plumbing, and carpenters who built interior spaces. The work was dangerous in ways that factory assembly was not. Men worked at heights, suspended on scaffolding high above the ground, or deep inside partially completed hulls. Welding created intense heat and bright light that could damage eyes without proper protection. Heavy equipment moved constantly, lifting steel plates that weighed tons. Accidents happened regularly. A cable might snap, sending a steel beam swinging. A worker might lose his footing on wet scaffolding. Flash fires erupted from welding sparks. Most injuries were minor, burns, cuts, and bruises that men treated themselves or had bandaged at the shipyard's medical station. But serious accidents occurred often enough that every worker knew someone who had been killed or permanently disabled. Crushed limbs, falls from height, electrocutions, these were the risks of shipyard work, accepted as part of the job. The wages compensated for the danger. Skilled shipyard workers earned more than most factory employees, sometimes $3 or $4 a day in the 1920s, climbing higher during the war years when overtime was constant. A welder or electrician could support a family comfortably, buy a house, and save money. The work was hard and hazardous, but it provided security and respect. These were craftsmen, not just laborers, and they took pride in their skills. R.C.A. Victor offered cleaner, safer work, but its own monotony. The assembly lines where phonographs and radios were built required precision and patience. Workers installed components following exact specifications, tightening screws, soldering connections, and testing each unit before it moved to the next station. The innovation happened in the engineering departments upstairs, where men in white shirts designed the next generation of products. The assembly floor was where those designs became physical objects. One unit at a time, thousands per day. The work was repetitive, but demanded attention. A radio assembled incorrectly would fail quality inspection, and too many failures meant discipline. Workers developed rhythms, their hands moving through the same motions hour after hour until the actions became automatic. Some found the work mind-numbing. Others appreciated that it was indoors, temperature-controlled, and lacked the dangers of heavy industry. The pay was decent if not spectacular, and RCA offered a stability that smaller manufacturers could not match. The unions gave workers power they had never possessed before. The United Auto Workers organized the assembly plants. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers represented the skilled trades. The unions negotiated contracts that guaranteed wages, limited hours, and improved safety conditions. They fought grievances when workers were treated unfairly. Most importantly, they provided solidarity. An injury to one was an injury to all. When the unions called, at strikes, workers walked out together, and the factories shut down completely. This solidarity created a culture where workers looked out for each other. An experienced worker would train a newcomer, teaching him the tricks that made difficult jobs easier. If someone was struggling to keep pace, others would help without being asked. When a worker was injured or died, collections were taken up and delivered to the family. These bonds were not sentimental, they were survival. In dangerous workplaces, you trusted your fellow workers with your life, and that trust extended beyond the factory gates. The unspoken bargain was simple. Workers gave their labor and loyalty, and corporations provided stable employment. Men expected to work for the same company their entire careers. They would start on the production floor and perhaps advance to supervisory positions. Their sons would follow them into the same factories. The corporation would remain in Camden, continuing to provide jobs for generation after generation. This arrangement was never written down, but everyone understood it and believed in it. The human cost was real, but accepted. Repetitive motion injuries plagued workers whose hands performed the same movements thousands of times daily. The noise caused hearing loss. Chemicals and dust led to respiratory problems. Long hours standing on concrete floors destroyed backs and knees. These injuries accumulated slowly, visible only in the way older workers moved stiffly or coughed constantly. Some workers retired at 65 and died within a year, their bodies worn out by decades of labor. Yet, despite the costs, the system worked in the way working people measured success. A man could support his family. He could buy a house. His children could attend school and have opportunities he had never had. The work was hard, but it meant something. The products made in Camden, soup that fed millions, ships that won wars, radios that brought entertainment into American homes, were contributions to the nation. Workers took pride in making things and using their hands and skills to create objects that would be used by people across the country. This was honest work that provided honest wages, and for several decades, that was enough. Chapter 5. Cracks in the Foundation. The end of World War II brought prosperity to America, but contained within it the seeds of Camden's destruction. The victory had been total, and the post-war economy boomed as soldiers returned home, started families, and pursued the American dream. But the shape of that dream was changing in ways that would prove devastating to older industrial cities. The future belonged to suburbs, highways, and new construction, not to the dense urban neighborhoods where Camden's strength had always resided. The automobile transformed everything. Car ownership, once a luxury, became standard for middle-class families. The federal government poured billions into highway construction through the interstate highway system, making it possible to live miles from work and commute by car. Suburbs exploded across the landscape surrounding older cities, offering something Camden could not: new houses with yards, garages, and separation from the industrial grit that defined urban life. The first to leave were those who could afford to. White middle-class families, many of whom had lived in Camden for generations, began moving to the suburbs in the 1950s. The new developments in Cherry Hill, Haddonfield, and other surrounding townships offered modern homes with amenities that Camden's aging row houses lacked. The marketing was explicit. These suburbs were clean, safe, and new. The implication was equally clear. Camden was dirty, dangerous, and old. Banks and government agencies accelerated this. Exodus through redlining. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, and later the Federal Housing Administration, created maps designating certain neighborhoods as hazardous investments, coloring them red on official maps. Camden's neighborhoods, particularly those with any black population, received the worst ratings. Mortgages in these areas became nearly impossible to obtain. Banks refused to lend. Property values stagnated or declined. Families who might have stayed and invested in their homes found themselves trapped in a market that had been officially declared worthless. The discrimination was systematic and devastating. A white family could secure a low-interest mortgage to buy a house in the suburbs with minimal down payment. A black family in Camden could not get a loan at any interest rate, regardless of employment or credit history. This was not informal bias, but federal policy, implemented with bureaucratic precision. The effect was to drain capital from Camden while subsidizing suburban growth, transferring wealth from the city to surrounding areas. As the middle class departed, the tax base began eroding. Property values declined as demand fell. Businesses followed their customers to the suburbs where new shopping centers offered free parking and modern facilities. Broadway, which had been Camden's vibrant commercial heart, started to thin out. Some stores closed, others cut inventory and staff. The street that had once buzzed with activity on Saturday nights grew quieter. The factories noticed the shifting economics. Campbell's Soup, which had been synonymous with Camden since 1869, began opening facilities in other locations. A plant in California made sense for processing West Coast tomatoes. Operations in the South took advantage of lower labor costs and weaker unions. The company insisted that Camden remain the headquarters, that the original facilities would always operate, but the diversification revealed a truth that many workers had not wanted to acknowledge. Camden was no longer essential to Campbell's success. Other manufacturers followed similar logic. The cost of doing business in the Northeast was rising. Unions had won significant wage increases and benefits. State regulations required safety measures and environmental controls. Workers had expectations about pay and conditions that came from decades of organized strength. Meanwhile, southern states offered tax incentives, right-to-work laws that weakened unions, and workforces willing to accept lower wages. The mathematics increasingly favored relocation. The first closures were small manufacturers, companies that employed dozens rather than thousands. A metal fabrication shop shut down and reopened in North Carolina. A textile plant moved to South Carolina. Each closure eliminated jobs, but individually they seemed manageable. Camden still had the major employers. The shipyard, Campbell's, and RCA Victor employed tens of thousands between them. Surely those giants would remain. Then came the highways, which physically severed Camden's neighborhoods. The construction of Interstate 6, 76, and Route 30 required demolishing hundreds of homes and businesses. The highways were designed to move suburban commuters through Camden to reach Philadelphia, not to serve Camden residents. The routes cut through neighborhoods, creating barriers that isolated communities from each other. Streets that had connected seamlessly were suddenly divided by elevated roadways and on-ramps. Urban renewal added injury to insult. The federal government provided funding for cities to clear blighted areas and replace them with modern developments. Camden officials embraced the program with enthusiasm, identifying large sections of the city for demolition. Entire blocks of row houses were torn down. The buildings were old and lacked modern amenities, but they were occupied and functional. Families were displaced with minimal compensation and unclear promises about replacement housing. What rose in place of the demolished neighborhoods disappointed everyone. Brutalist housing projects appeared, designed with modernist principles that ignored how people actually lived. The projects concentrated poverty in towers that became difficult to maintain and dangerous to inhabit. Parking lots replaced blocks of homes. Empty lots appeared where buildings had been demolished, but nothing new was built. Urban renewal turned out to be urban removal, destroying working-class neighborhoods without creating anything better. The population peaked around 1950 at nearly 125,000, then began a decline that would accelerate with each passing decade. The 1960 census showed the losses clearly. Thousands of residents had left, and the demographic composition was changing. African Americans, who had been a small minority in Camden before World War II, now represented a growing portion of the population as Black families migrated from the South, seeking opportunities in northern cities. The timing was cruelly ironic. Black Americans arrived in Camden just as the economic engine was beginning to fail. They came seeking the factory jobs that had provided security for earlier waves of immigrants. But those jobs were disappearing. The shipyard was reducing employment. Campbell's was hiring fewer workers. Smaller manufacturers were closing or relocating. The Great Migration North, which had brought Black families to industrial cities in search of opportunity, delivered them to places where that opportunity was already evaporating. Racial integration was occurring precisely as economic decline accelerated, creating a toxic political dynamic that would plague Camden for decades. White residents leaving for suburbs could tell themselves they were seeking better schools and newer homes. But the timing coincided exactly with increasing Black population. The departure looked like white flight because it was white flight, motivated by racism as much as economics. Black residents found themselves inheriting a city that was already being abandoned, blamed for decline they had not caused, and denied the opportunities that earlier immigrants had enjoyed. The patterns were established by the early 1960s. The middle class was leaving. The tax base was shrinking, factories were closing or relocating, highways had divided neighborhoods. Urban renewal had demolished more than it created. The population was declining and changing composition. Property values were falling. Commercial districts were thinning out. Every indicator pointed in the same direction. Yet many people still believed the decline was temporary, that the factories would stabilize, that Camden would adapt and recover. They were wrong. The cracks that appeared in the 1950s would become a complete collapse in the decades that followed. Chapter 6. The Collapse. The collapse, when it came, was not gradual. It was sudden, violent, and total. The 1960s and 1970s saw Camden transform from a struggling industrial city into an urban disaster zone. What had taken nearly a century to build disintegrated in less than 2 decades, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell where a functioning city had once existed. The first devastating blow landed in 1967, when New York shipbuilding announced it would close. The company had been Camden's largest employer for nearly 70 years, at its peak, providing work for over 35,000 people. The closure did not happen all at once, but unfolded over several years as contracts ended and were not renewed. Workers watched as the building ways fell silent, as the cranes stopped moving, as entire sections of the massive facility shut down. By 1968, the shipyard was finished, and with it went not just jobs, but an entire skilled workforce that had defined Camden's industrial identity. The impact rippled through the entire city. 35,000 jobs represented not just the workers themselves, but the families they supported, the businesses that served them, the tax revenue they generated. Restaurants near the shipyard gates closed because the lunch crowds disappeared. Bars that had thrived on shipyard workers stopped opening. Shops that had sold work clothes and tools shut their doors. The economic ecosystem that had grown around the shipyard collapsed when its anchor disappeared. The workers scattered. Some found jobs in other shipyards along the coast, uprooting families to chase the same work they had done in Camden. Others retrained for different industries, accepting pay cuts and starting over in middle age. Many simply gave up, joining the growing ranks of unemployed men whose skills were no longer needed. The closure announcement hit workers in their 40s and 50s particularly hard, old enough that retraining seemed impossible, young enough that retirement was decades away. RCA Victor followed a slower but equally devastating path. The company had been acquired by General Electric in 1986, but the decline began much earlier. Throughout the 1970s, RCA shifted production to facilities in other states and countries where labor costs were lower. The Camden facilities, which had once employed thousands, saw their workforce reduced year by year. Buildings that had hummed with activity stood partially empty. Sections were closed and locked. The company maintained a presence in Camden, but it was a shadow of what had existed before. The Nipper building, with its famous stained glass window, became a symbol of abandonment. The massive facility sat largely unused, a monument to past innovation now serving no purpose. Eventually, RCA would leave Camden entirely, taking with it the jobs, the research facilities, and the technological prestige that had made the city a center of American innovation. Campbell Soup remained, but on its own terms. The company kept its headquarters in Camden, maintaining its historic connection to the city. But employment at the Camden facilities declined steadily as production shifted to plants in other states. The company needed fewer workers as automation improved and operations diversified geographically. Camden was still Campbell's official home, but increasingly that status was symbolic rather than economic. The soup was being made elsewhere by fewer people at lower cost. The suburban exodus, which had begun as a trickle in the 1950s, became a flood in the 1960s and accelerated through the 1970s. Anyone with resources left. Middle-class families who had stayed through the early decline now fled. Teachers, police officers, small business owners, skilled workers, all the people who formed a city's stable core, departed for suburbs that offered safety, better schools, and property values that increased rather than collapsed. Entire neighborhoods emptied. Blocks that had been fully occupied in 1960 showed vacancy rates of 30, 40, 50% by 1975. Families moved out and no one moved in. Houses sat empty, their windows broken by vandals, their copper pipes stripped by thieves. Landlords abandoned properties rather than pay taxes on buildings worth less than the tax bill. The city government took possession of thousands of properties through tax foreclosure, becoming the reluctant owner of neighborhoods it could not maintain or sell. The tax base collapsed in a vicious spiral. As property values fell and population declined, the revenue available to the city government plummeted. Services had to be cut. Fewer police officers patrolled larger areas. Fire stations closed, increasing response times. Street maintenance stopped. Potholes went unfilled. Streetlights went unrepaired. Parks grew wild and dangerous. The deteriorating services made the city less desirable, encouraging more people to leave, which further reduced revenue, requiring more cuts. The cycle fed itself, accelerating with each passing year. Schools deteriorated fastest and most visibly. Buildings that had been maintained for decades fell into disrepair. Roofs leaked. Heating systems failed. Textbooks were outdated and scarce. Teacher salaries, already lower than suburban districts, could not compete when the city faced budget crises. The best teachers left for positions elsewhere. Class sizes grew as fewer staff managed more students. Test scores fell, graduation rates dropped. Parents who cared about education and had any means to leave did so, taking their children to districts where schools still functioned. Those who remained were the poorest families with no alternative, and their children attended schools that could barely operate. Crime exploded into the vacuum left by legitimate economy. When factories closed and jobs disappeared, young men with no prospects turned to drug dealing, robbery, and other crimes of survival and desperation. The heroin epidemic that swept American cities in the 1970s hit Camden with particular force. The drug trade established itself in abandoned buildings, operating openly in neighborhoods where police presence had thinned to near invisibility. Violence accompanied the trade. Shootings became common. Residents stopped going out after dark. The city that had once been a safe place to raise a family became dangerous to walk through. In August 1971, tensions exploded into 3 days of riots. The immediate cause was the police beating of a Puerto Rican motorist, but the underlying causes ran much deeper. Unemployment, poverty, police brutality, and the accumulated rage of people watching their city die around them. Buildings burned, stores were looted. The National Guard was called in. To restore order, the riots made national news, cementing Camden's image as a city in crisis and scaring away what little investment interest remained. Political leadership failed catastrophically when it was needed most. Corruption had always existed in Camden's politics. Machine politics and patronage were features of industrial cities. But as the city declined, the corruption became more brazen and more damaging. City officials were caught in kickback schemes, accepting bribes, and steering contracts to connected insiders. Resources that should have gone to schools or police or infrastructure disappeared into private pockets. Investigations and prosecutions came too late to save anything. The corruption deepened public cynicism and destroyed what little faith remained in government's ability to address the crisis. Banks redlined not just neighborhoods, but the entire city. No financial institution would lend in Camden for any purpose. Families who wanted to buy homes could not get mortgages. Small business owners could not secure loans to expand or even maintain their operations. Developers had no access to capital for projects. The lack of credit killed any possibility of organic recovery, ensuring that decline would continue until nothing remained. Camden became a place where money flowed out but never in, where every transaction involved extraction rather than investment. The commercial districts died completely. Broadway, which had been the bustling heart of Camden's retail life, became a corridor of shuttered storefronts and abandoned buildings. Department stores closed. Movie theaters shut down and were torn down or left to rot. Restaurants and shops that had served generations of families locked their doors permanently. By the end of the 1970s, downtown Camden was largely empty, its buildings hollow, its sidewalks deserted, except for those with no other place to go. The population collapse told the story in raw numbers. Camden had peaked near 125,000 residents in 1950. By 1970, that number had fallen to 102,000. By 1980, it was below 85,000. The decline would continue through subsequent decades, eventually dropping below 80,000. But the raw numbers understated the reality because the composition had changed so dramatically. The people leaving were middle class, employed, educated, and mobile. The people remaining were the poorest residents who had no ability to leave, no resources to start over elsewhere, nowhere else to go. The speed of the collapse stunned even those who had watched it unfold. A city that had functioned however imperfectly in 1960 was in complete crisis by 1980. 20 years, one generation. The factories that had defined Camden for a century had closed or relocated. The population had dropped by a third. Property values had collapsed. Crime had exploded. Schools had failed. City services had been cut to the bone. What had taken nearly a century to build, the factories, the neighborhoods, the infrastructure, the community institutions, had fallen apart in 2 decades. Camden became a dumping ground for regional problems that more prosperous areas did not want. Halfway houses were open to serve parolees. Drug treatment centers relocated to Camden from wealthier municipalities. Low-income housing projects concentrated poverty in ways that made dysfunction inevitable. The surrounding suburbs benefited from Camden's decline, siphoning off the middle class while ensuring that poverty and its associated problems remained contained within city limits. This was not conspiracy, but the predictable result of segregation, both racial and economic, operating at metropolitan scale. The people who remained faced a city that had stopped functioning in any meaningful sense. Garbage collection was sporadic. Police responded slowly, if at all. Fire stations were understaffed. Schools prepared children for nothing except more poverty. Jobs were scarce and mostly paid minimum wage. Housing stock deteriorated as landlords abandoned properties and the city lacked resources to maintain what it had seized through foreclosure. Hospitals closed or reduced services. Grocery stores left, creating food deserts where residents had to travel miles to buy fresh food. The tragedy was not just economic, but human. Families who had lived in Camden for generations, who had worked in the factories and built their lives around the promise of stable employment, watched everything disintegrate. The elderly, who had spent their working years in the shipyards and factories, found themselves trapped in a city that no longer resembled the one they had known. Children grew up in neighborhoods, dominated by abandoned buildings, where gunshots were routine, where the concept of a normal childhood had been replaced by survival. By 1980, Camden had become a national symbol of urban failure. Journalists came to document the devastation. Sociologists studied it as a case of complete urban collapse. Politicians pointed to it as an example of what could happen to American cities. But no one proposed solutions that matched the scale of the disaster. The corporations that had built Camden and profited from it for a century were gone. Their obligations ended, their wealth transferred to shareholders who had never set foot in the city. Camden was left to deal with the consequences alone, without the resources, leadership, or economic base to do anything except manage decline. Chapter 7. The Corporate Responsibility. Question. The question of who benefited and who paid reveals the fundamental injustice at the heart of Camden's story. For nearly a century, corporations extracted enormous wealth from the city. They employed thousands, yes, but they also generated profits that flowed to distant shareholders and executives who had no connection to the place where that wealth was created. When the economics changed, when it became more profitable to operate elsewhere, those same corporations departed without obligation or consequence, leaving behind the devastation their departure created. Campbell's Soup built an empire in Camden. The company became one of the most recognizable brands in America, its red and white cans appearing in millions of homes. The wealth generated from soup production made the Campbell family and their shareholders rich beyond measure. The company's founders and executives lived in Philadelphia's mainline suburbs, in estates that reflected the fortune extracted from Camden's factory floors. The workers who actually made the soup lived in row houses blocks from the plant, their wages sufficient for modest comfort, but never for the kind of wealth their labor created. When Campbell's diversified its operations, opening plants across the country and eventually around the world, the profits continued to flow to the same shareholders and executives. The company maintained its headquarters in Camden, trading on the historic connection for brand prestige, while steadily reducing its local workforce. The arrangement was purely extractive. Camden provided the brand origin story, but the economic benefits went elsewhere. By the time Camden was in crisis, Campbell's had long since stopped depending on the city, though the city still depended on Campbell's. RCA Victor followed a similar pattern. The innovations developed in Camden, advances in radio, recording, and television technology, generated enormous wealth. The company's engineers and technicians created products that changed American life, working in facilities that became world-renowned centers of innovation. The patents, the designs, the technological breakthroughs all came from work done in Camden. But the profits belonged to corporate owners and shareholders, most of whom lived in New York or other financial centers. When RCA decided to manufacture products more cheaply elsewhere, the innovations continued to generate wealth, but Camden's role ended. The creativity and skill that had built the company's success were no longer needed in the city where they had originated. The shipyard's trajectory revealed the most cynical exploitation. During both World Wars, New York shipbuilding operated at maximum capacity, building vessels essential to national defense. The work is dangerous, the hours long, but the contracts were lucrative. The company made millions in war profits while paying workers wages that, though good for the time, represented a tiny fraction of the revenue each ship generated. When the wars ended and military contracts dried up, the company closed the yards without ceremony. The workers who had built the ships that won the wars were dismissed. The profits from those war years belonged to investors who had risked only capital, never their lives. The relationship between corporations and Camden was fundamentally one way. The companies took labor, location, and local resources. In return, they provided wages but nothing more. They paid taxes, but only what they could not avoid through accounting and negotiation. They built factories, but those were investments that benefited the corporation first, and the city only incidentally. When the buildings were no longer profitable, the companies walked away, leaving Camden to deal with abandoned structures it could not afford to demolish or maintain. No corporation owed Camden a pension. No legal obligation required them to maintain operations or compensate the city for the economic devastation their departure caused. The workers received whatever retirement benefits their union contracts had secured, though many lost even those when companies declared bankruptcy or restructured. But the city itself received nothing. The infrastructure that had been built to serve the factories, roads, water systems, electrical grids, became the city's burden to maintain after the factories closed. The cost of dealing with environmental contamination from decades of industrial production fell to Camden, not to the companies that had created the pollution. The executives and major shareholders who profited from Camden's industrial success lived elsewhere. They had always lived elsewhere. They made decisions about Camden's fate from boardrooms in New York and Philadelphia, from homes in wealthy suburbs, from vacation properties in places far, removed from the consequences of their choices. When they closed factories or relocated operations, they faced no personal cost. Their children did not attend Camden's failing schools. Their families were not trapped in neighborhoods turned dangerous by unemployment. They experienced Camden's collapse, if they thought about it at all, as an abstraction, a line item in a corporate restructuring plan. The human cost remained invisible in the metrics that corporations measured. Quarterly earnings reports showed increased profits from lower labor costs and improved efficiency. Shareholder presentations highlighted successful restructuring and geographic diversification. Stock prices rose when companies announced closures that reduced expenses. None of these measures captured what happened to the workers who lost jobs, the families who lost homes, the children who grew up in poverty, or the city that was transformed from functional to desperate. The suffering was real and profound, but it did not appear in any document that corporate decision-makers reviewed. Camden's fundamental mistake was putting all its economic eggs in corporate baskets. The city never developed a diversified economy. It had factories and the businesses that served factory workers, nothing more. No major university provided stable employment and attracted educated residents. No significant financial sector offered alternative career paths. No tourism or cultural industries supplemented manufacturing. Camden was an industrial city, completely and totally, and when industry left, nothing remained. The city never owned its own economic fate. Every major decision about Camden's future was made by people who did not live there and had no stake in its success beyond profit margins. This was not unique to Camden. It was the standard relationship between corporations and the cities where they operated. But the concentration of major employers in such a small city, combined with the complete lack of economic diversity, made Camden exceptionally vulnerable to forces beyond its control. Company towns at least had the honesty of explicit ownership. When a coal company built a town around a mine, everyone understood the relationship. The company owned everything, and when the mine closed, the town would die. Camden functioned the same way, but without the clarity. It was a company town writ large, dependent on corporations that made no promises and accepted no obligations. The illusion of independence made the betrayal more complete. The vulnerability of manufacturing-dependent cities was exposed across America in the late 20th century. Camden was simply an early and extreme example of a pattern that would repeat in Detroit, Gary, Youngstown, and dozens of other places where industry had been everything. These cities learned too late that corporations are mobile in ways communities are not, that profit logic eventually overwhelms any sense of obligation, and that the people left behind will bear the cost of decisions made in distant boardrooms by people who will never face the consequences. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. Through the 1980s, 1990s, and into the 2000s, Camden became synonymous with urban failure. The city earned rankings as the most dangerous in America, appearing regularly on lists that measured violent crime, poverty rates, and economic distress. These were not distinctions anyone in Camden wanted, but they reflected a reality impossible to deny. The collapse that had begun in the 1970s continued and deepened, transforming Camden into a cautionary tale, a place that represented everything that could go wrong with American cities. The drug trade filled the vacuum left by legitimate economy. Heroin had arrived in the 1970s, but crack cocaine in the 1980s brought violence to levels the city had never experienced. Dealers operated openly on street corners. Abandoned buildings became drug houses where addicts gathered to use, and dealers stored their product. Entire blocks were controlled by drug organizations that functioned as parallel governments, providing employment and enforcing order through violence. For young men with no prospects, dealing drugs offered the only path to income that seemed achievable. The work was dangerous and often short-lived, but so was unemployment and poverty. Violence reached epidemic levels that shocked even hardened observers. Murders occurred almost daily. Shootings were so common, they rarely made the news unless particularly brutal or involving multiple victims. Drive-by shootings, executions, drug disputes that ended in death. These became routine features of Camden life. Residents learned to recognize the sound of different firearms, to drop to the floor when shooting started, to avoid certain streets after dark. Children grew up understanding that violence was not an aberration, but a constant presence, woven into the fabric of daily existence. The physical city deteriorated beyond recognition. Buildings that had stood for a century were abandoned, then stripped of anything valuable, then left to rot. Copper pipes, electrical wiring, fixtures, doors, anything that could be sold was removed by scavengers. What remained were hollow shells, dangerous and unsightly. Eventually, many were demolished, leaving empty lots where homes and businesses had once stood. Entire city blocks returned to vacant land, creating an urban prairie dotted with the foundations of demolished structures. The landscape looked bombed out, as if Camden had suffered warfare rather than economic collapse. The demolition created a perverse paradox. The city could not afford to maintain the buildings, so they were torn down. But vacant lots attracted illegal dumping, became sites for drug activity, and further depressed surrounding property values. The empty spaces that resulted from demolition made the city feel even more abandoned, even more hopeless. What had been dense urban fabric was replaced by gaps and absences. A city defined more by what was missing than by what remained. Schools reached depths of failure that seemed designed to ensure poverty would continue across generations. Camden's public schools ranked among the worst in the nation by every measure: test scores, graduation rates, college attendance, teacher quality, facility conditions. Buildings were decrepit, with leaking roofs, broken windows, and heating systems that failed regularly. Teachers were often inexperienced, unable to find positions elsewhere, using Camden as a temporary stepping stone to better districts. Class sizes were large, resources scarce, and expectations low. Students who showed academic promise were advised by counselors to leave Camden if they wanted any chance at success. The police force was overwhelmed and underfunded to the point of near uselessness. With the tax base collapsed, the city could not afford adequate staffing. Officers patrolled areas too large to cover effectively. Response times stretched to hours for non-emergency calls, and even emergency calls sometimes went unanswered when all units were engaged elsewhere. The department faced accusations of corruption, brutality, and incompetence. Some officers were arrested for participating in the drug trade they were supposed to fight. Public trust in police, never high, evaporated completely. Residents stopped calling the police because they knew no one would come, or, worse, that police intervention would make things more dangerous. Fire services faced similar crises. Stations closed due to budget cuts. Response times increased, meaning fires burned longer and caused more damage. Arson became common as property owners sought insurance payouts on buildings worth less than their debt. Firefighters worked with outdated equipment and insufficient staffing, risking their lives to protect a city that could not afford to protect them. The job became less about saving property Most of it was worthless anyway, and more about preventing fires from spreading to buildings where people still lived. The state government attempted interventions that mostly failed. State takeovers of the school system and city finances were supposed to bring expertise and resources that Camden lacked. Instead, they brought bureaucracy and decisions made by people who did not understand the city's problems or care about its residents. The takeovers stripped local control without providing meaningful improvement. State-appointed overseers implemented policies designed for other contexts, failing to address Camden's specific catastrophic conditions. In 2011, the city took the controversial step of dissolving its police force entirely and rebuilding it as a county-level department. The move was presented as necessary reform. The existing force was too corrupt and dysfunctional to save. Critics called it union busting and an attack on public employees who were themselves victims of impossible circumstances. The new department was larger and better equipped, but whether it was more effective remained hotly debated. Crime statistics showed improvement in some years, but residents reported that their daily experience of danger had not changed significantly. The population continued its relentless decline. By 2000, fewer than 80,000 people lived in Camden. By 2010, that number had dropped below 77,000. The city built for 125,000 was now home to barely half that number. The people remaining were the poorest of the poor, trapped in a place where economic mobility was nearly impossible. The middle class had long since vanished. Professionals who worked in Camden, the few who remained, commuted from suburbs and left before dark. Waterfront redevelopment became the focus of revitalization efforts, but the project served suburban visitors rather than Camden residents. The Adventure Aquarium opened in 1992, a modern facility that attracted tourists from across the region. The Waterfront Entertainment District followed, with a concert venue and eventually the Battleship New Jersey Museum. These developments created jobs, mostly low-wage service positions, and brought visitors who spent money in controlled environments before returning to their suburbs. The projects did nothing to address the poverty, violence, and decay in neighborhoods blocks away from the shining waterfront. The contrast between the redeveloped waterfront and the rest of Camden felt insulting to many residents. Millions were invested in attractions for tourists while schools crumbled and neighborhoods lacked basic services. The developments were designed to keep visitors contained in safe zones, with clear boundaries marking where they should not venture. The message was explicit. Camden's waterfront could be enjoyed by outsiders, but the city itself remained too dangerous for anyone who had a choice to be elsewhere. Young people with talent, intelligence, or ambition left as soon as they could. The brain drain was total and devastating. If you were smart enough to attend college, you left Camden and never returned. If you had skills that could earn decent wages elsewhere, you moved. The city lost exactly the people it needed most to rebuild, creating a cycle where only those without options remained. Parents told their children that success meant escape, and the children who succeeded followed that advice, leaving Camden to those who could not follow. Generational poverty became entrenched in ways that seemed impossible to break. Children born into Camden in the 1980s grew up in violence and poverty, attended failing schools, and became adults with limited prospects. Their children, born in the 2000s, inherited the same conditions, only worse. Families who had been working class in the 1960s were desperately poor by the 1990s. The memory of Camden as a place where hard work led to stability became myth, contradicted by the lived reality of multiple generations for whom hard work led nowhere because no legitimate work existed. Camden had become what sociologists called a concentrated poverty trap, a place where poverty created conditions that made escaping poverty nearly impossible. Chapter 9. The Warning. Camden's story is a warning that every American city should understand. The danger of building an economy around corporations that owe nothing to the place they occupy has been demonstrated with brutal clarity. Corporations are mobile. They can relocate operations with relative ease, chasing lower costs and higher profits. Communities are permanent. The people who live in Camden cannot simply move their city when the economics change. This fundamental mismatch created a vulnerability that proved catastrophic when exploited. The speed of Camden's destruction reveals how quickly a functioning city can be dismantled. 2 decades separated Camden at its peak from Camden in crisis. One generation watched everything their parents had built collapse into ruin. The factories that had seemed permanent disappeared. The neighborhoods that had been full emptied out. The institutions that had provided structure and meaning closed their doors. What took a century to create was destroyed in 20 years, and the destruction was not natural disaster, but calculated economic decisions made by people who faced no consequences. The human cost remains invisible in the statistics that measure economic success. Camden appears in data as poverty rates, crime statistics, and property values. These numbers are accurate but incomplete. They do not capture what it means to grow up in a place where opportunity does not exist, where violence is routine, where every institution has failed. They do not measure the loss of community, the erasure of culture, the destruction of possibility. The people who remained in Camden are not statistics. They are human beings trapped in a city that was abandoned by everyone with the power to help. Camden today is poor but still inhabited. Around 70,000 people live in the city, making lives under circumstances that would break most communities. Their resilience deserves recognition even as their suffering demands acknowledgement. They maintain churches, raise children, and work jobs that barely pay enough to survive. They persist in a place that has been declared worthless by every measure American society uses to assign value. The proximity paradox makes Camden's poverty even more striking. Minutes across the Delaware River sits wealth, opportunity, and prosperity. The contrast is not geographical, but structural, the result of decisions about who deserves investment and who can be abandoned. Camden and Philadelphia are neighbors, but they exist in different economic realities separated by more than water. What was lost in Camden was more than jobs. It was community built over generations, ethnic cultures that had maintained identity while becoming American, institutions that had provided meaning and connection, and the fundamental belief that hard work would be rewarded with security. The empty factories stand as monuments to extraction, reminders that corporations took everything they wanted and left when there was nothing more to take. Camden's warning is clear. Cities that depend entirely on corporate goodwill are vulnerable to corporate betrayal. No easy answers exist for how to prevent what happened to Camden from happening elsewhere. But the lessons must be learned. This is what happens when a city works itself to death, for companies that walk away without looking back.